All right, today we're going to talk about carbohydrates, and carbohydrates are one of the 4 macromolecules that we're going to discuss throughout this unit. Carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and typically you see them in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. So for example, if you see here we have glucose. Glucose comes in the form C6H12O6, meaning there are 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens bound together. And so if you were to reduce these numbers and just did basic math, it would be in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. And basically, living things, including us, right, we're living, use carbohydrates as their main source of energy. So the energy that you get when you run is from carbohydrates. They break down into sugars, for example, glucose, and we can get immediate energy for cell activities. So if any of you are cross-country or track runners, I know when I was in track, we used to have pasta parties like the day before a race, and we'd basically make a bunch of pasta, eat a bunch of bread, because that was that carbohydrates, those carbs are able to store up in our body, and we had basically an amount of glucose ready for us to run that race. So if you don't do pasta parties, I think you should if you're a runner. And we can break down carbohydrates into different categories. And so what we have is a monosaccharide. It's just a fancy name, mono meaning one, and it is the monomer of carbohydrates. Remember that a monomer is something that is in its single unit. So it's the monomer of carbohydrates. And it's a single sugar molecule. For example, glucose is a monomer. And galactose is the sugar that we see in milk, and fructose is the sugar in fruit. So the FRU right there should help you to recognize that it is a part of fruit. And the polymer of carbohydrates is a disaccharide. Di is referring to 2. Okay? The polymer of carbohydrates. So you can take some monomers, right? Monosaccharide and a monosaccharide, and that's what a disaccharide equals, the polymer of carbohydrates. So you can see here in this picture, it's a very fancy picture of a carbohydrate, but this is one right here, this is one right here, and they are joined in the middle by an oxygen. Okay, 2 sugars bonded together. An example of that would be sucrose, the sugar sucrose. You have glucose and fructose together. And then also maltose. 2 glucose molecules together would give you a maltose. And the last type of polymer is a polysaccharide. Poly, that prefix is referring to many. So a polysaccharide has many monosaccharides put together. So if you look at that picture below, you can see that this is a monomer, that one is a monomer, this one is a monomer, this one is a monomer, this one is a monomer. And that equals glucose. I'm sorry, that equals starch. So all of these monomers right here are a glucose, and many of them together gives you a starch. Another example would also be glycogen. And then also cellulose, and cellulose we see inside of plants. So this is the sugar that's inside of leaves, trees, flower stems, those sorts of things. And what we have happening in animals is that glycogen is typically stored for excess sugar. So glycogen will build up inside of an animal when we have too much sugar intake. And so when your level of glucose in your blood begins to run low, that storage of glucose, which is in the form of glycogen, remember that this is a polysaccharide, okay, it breaks down into glucose, and then the glucose molecules will then be released into the blood. So we can store up lots of sugar to be used, which is kind of why, you know, when you have those pasta parties before a race, you get all those glucose molecules being stored as glycogen, and during your race, glycogen is going to get broken down and it's going to turn right into glucose. And then that glycogen for humans is stored within the muscles. And so when you're running, you can have that energy and that storage for your muscle contraction. In plants, we have starch, that is the excess sugar, and cellulose is also used within the cell wall and gives the cell wall strength and rigidity within the plant. So you can see an example here. We have on the left-hand side, we have the starch, which is the plant polysaccharide, and it is stored within these structures here. And there's a couple of examples of what that looks like. And then over here, we have glycogen within the body. So remember that starch gets stored as for plants. Glycogen is an animal's storage, and these are polysaccharides. Many monomers of carbohydrates stored together as a polysaccharide. And that's it for carbohydrates.